There's a particular kind of humbling that only a garden can deliver. It's early July, maybe 6 in the morning, and you're already on your knees in the dirt pulling grass from between your tomatoes for what feels like the third time this week. You've got 5 different sprays on the shelf, some organic, some not. You stopped reading the labels 2 summers ago, and your squash still looks like something went wrong at a cellular level. The leaves are yellowed at the edges. There's a powdery film you don't want to think about. You did everything the bag said to do. You did everything the YouTube video said to do. And here you are, on your knees, in the dirt, again. I know that feeling exactly. I lived it for the better part of 20 years. What changed everything for me wasn't a new product. It wasn't a new tool. It wasn't even new information, exactly. It was a drive I took one afternoon through a part of the county where old order Amish families have been farming the same land for 4 or 5 generations. I wasn't looking for a lesson. I was honestly just cutting through on a back road. But I slowed down at one point because something caught my eye, and I sat there at the edge of that road for probably 10 minutes, just staring into a kitchen garden attached to a white farmhouse, trying to figure out what I was looking at. The plants were enormous, genuinely large. Tomatoes staked high and heavy with fruit, pole beans wrapping up their poles in tight spirals, squash leaves the size of dinner plates fanning out along the ground. But what stopped me wasn't the size of the plants, it was what wasn't there. No yellow leaves, no powdery residue, no bare dirt baking between rows. The whole thing looked like it was running on its own, like it had figured out how to take care of itself. And at the edge of the garden, hanging a sheet on a line, was a woman who I'd guess hadn't spent the last 3 mornings on her knees pulling grass. That was the moment I started asking questions. What I eventually came to understand, through a lot of conversations, a lot of reading, and honestly a lot of sitting quietly in my own garden and watching, is that what I'd been looking at wasn't just a well-tended garden. It was a system, a companion planting system that these communities have refined across generations, built on a logic so old and so practical that modern agricultural science spent decades catching up to it. And the core of that logic is this: plants don't grow best alone. They grow best in community. Some of them fix nitrogen that others need. Some of them repel the insects that would otherwise devastate their neighbors. Some of them create shade that keeps the soil cool and moist, which means you water less and weed less because the conditions for weeds are simply worse. The garden doesn't fight nature, it borrows from it. And when you set it up right, it does a shocking amount of work without you. I want to be straight with you about something before we go further, because I think you deserve honest expectations more than a good sales pitch. Companion planting is not a magic switch. You're not going to plant a few things next to each other and walk away for a season. There's still work involved, especially in the first year while you're learning which combinations actually perform on your specific soil, in your specific climate, with your specific pest pressure. What companion planting does is change the nature of the work. Instead of reactive work, spraying, treating, patching, salvaging, you shift toward proactive design. You do more thinking in the spring and less suffering in July. That trade has been, for me personally, more than worth it, but I'd rather you start with honest expectations than have you abandon a genuinely excellent system because the first season had a learning curve. Here's the foundation you need to understand. Every garden, whether you intend it or not, is already a community of interactions. Roots are communicating through fungal networks in the soil. Volatile compounds released from one plant's leaves are already affecting the behavior of insects around its neighbors. Allopathic chemicals from some plants are already suppressing the germination of seeds in the nearby soil. You didn't design those interactions. They're happening anyway. What companion planting does is give you the ability to intentionally design those interactions rather than just inheriting them by default. You become the architect of a set of relationships that have been working in ecosystems for millions of years. You're not inventing anything, you're applying what's already true. Let's start with a combination that most people have heard of, but very few people use correctly: the 3 sisters: corn, beans, and squash. This system was developed and refined by indigenous North American farming communities across centuries, and it's probably the most thoroughly validated companion planting arrangement that exists. The corn grows tall and provides a structure for the pole beans to climb, which means you don't need to build separate infrastructure for your beans. The beans, as legumes, fix atmospheric nitrogen into the soil in a form that corn and squash can use, which means you're running a fertilization system inside the garden without adding anything from outside. The squash sprawls low and wide, covering the ground with those large leaves, which suppresses weeds and slows evaporation from the soil. 3 plants, 3 jobs, 1 system. The reason most people don't get full results from this arrangement is spacing. They plant it too tight. You need to give the corn enough room to actually form a real canopy before the beans start climbing in earnest. 12 to 18 inches between corn plants, beans planted at the base once the corn is about 6 inches tall, and squash started at the perimeter of the cluster so its vines have room to run outward rather than choking the center. Get the spacing right, and this system essentially manages its own fertility and ground cover for the entire growing season. Tomatoes are where most experienced gardeners have their biggest frustration, and honestly where companion planting makes the most dramatic visible difference. The classic pairing is tomatoes and basil, which you've probably heard, but the reason it works is more interesting than most people realize. Basil releases specific volatile compounds, primarily linalool and estragol, that have been shown in controlled studies to repel thrips and aphids, 2 of the most common vectors for viral disease in tomato plants. It also appears to have some effect on tomato hornworm behavior, though that mechanism is less clear. Plant basil 10 to 12 inches from your tomato plants, not right at the base, and plant it densely enough that the aromatic compounds have real presence in the immediate air column around the tomatoes. But here's what most tomato growers miss. Pair your tomatoes with marigolds on the perimeter of the bed. Not French marigolds as decoration, but as a functional root barrier. Marigold roots produce a compound called alpha-terthionil that is directly toxic to root knot nematodes in the soil. If you've ever lost tomatoes to what looked like root problems, stunted growth, wilting that doesn't respond to water, nematodes may be the culprit, and a border of marigolds around your tomato bed, planted the season before or at the same time, can reduce that pressure dramatically. Combine basil inside the bed with marigolds on the edge, and you have above-ground pest suppression and below-ground pest suppression working simultaneously. Brassicas, your cabbage, broccoli, kale, Brussels sprouts, are some of the hungriest plants in the kitchen garden, and also some of the most attractive to pest insects, particularly cabbage moths and aphids. The trap cropping strategy is one of the most underused tools in the experienced gardener's kit, and it works like this. You plant a sacrificial crop that the target pest strongly prefers right at the edge of your brassica bed. Nasturtiums for aphids, blue Hubbard squash as a perimeter trap for squash vine borers near your main crop. The pest finds the trap crop first, concentrates on it, and your main crop experiences significantly reduced pressure. You then manage the trap crop aggressively, removing infested leaves, washing plants, occasionally pulling the whole plant, rather than managing the pest across your entire brassica bed. It sounds counterintuitive to invite the pest in, but controlled concentration is easier to manage than diffuse infestation. Pair this with interplanting dill or fennel near your brassicas, which draws in parasitic wasps that prey on cabbage moth larvae, and you have a push-pull system running inside the same bed. The nasturtiums pull the aphids, the dill pulls the beneficial wasps that reduce the caterpillar load. Your brassicas sit in the middle of that arrangement and produce heavily without you applying anything. Now let me walk through the mistakes that experienced gardeners most commonly make with companion planting, because this is where a lot of frustration comes from, and I'd rather name these directly. The first is treating companions as a substitute for soil health. Companion planting performs best in biologically active soil. If your soil is compacted, low in organic matter, or has been heavily treated with synthetic inputs that have suppressed microbial life, the underground communication systems that help make companion relationships work are compromised. Before you design a companion planting arrangement, spend a season building the soil. Compost, Mulch, reduce tillage, let the biology come back. Then the companion relationships have a medium to actually operate in. The second mistake is ignoring allopathic interference. Some plants actively suppress the germination and growth of others, and most gardeners don't know which ones until they've had a bad season. Fennel is the most important one to understand. Fennel is genuinely allopathic to a wide range of vegetables: tomatoes, peppers, beans, kohlrabi. It releases compounds from its roots and decomposing foliage that inhibit the growth of neighboring plants. Plant fennel in a container or in a dedicated spot well away from your main beds. I planted it inside a mixed bed for 2 years before I understood why that section of the bed always underperformed. The third mistake is planting companions at the wrong time relative to each other. A companion that's supposed to be in bloom when a pest pressure peaks does nothing if it hasn't been established yet. Work backward from your pest pressure timeline and make sure your companions are mature and functioning before the problem arrives, not after. Here's something that took me a long time to understand, and that I think most content about companion planting misses entirely. The system works best when you stop thinking in terms of individual plant pairs and start thinking in terms of guilds. A guild is a group of plants selected to collectively serve a set of functions in the same growing space: soil fertility, pest suppression, ground cover, pollinator attraction, and canopy structure. When you design a guild, rather than just pairing 2 plants together, you get redundancy. If one companion underperforms in a particular season, others pick up the function. The Three Sisters is a simple guild. A mature companion planting system in a mixed kitchen garden might have 4, 5, or 6 plants in a given bed, each playing a specific role, and the interaction between all of them together is more stable and more productive than any single pairing. Think in systems, not pairs. That's the shift that makes the difference between a good season and a great one. The technique I want to leave you with is one I almost never see discussed online, and I'm honestly not sure why, because it is one of the most practical things you can add to an existing companion system without redesigning anything. It's called a living mulch understory, and here's how it works. Instead of bare ground or wood chip mulch between your larger plants, you establish a low-growing, ground-covering companion plant. Clover is the most practical for most climates. Creeping thyme works well in drier zones. Buckwheat if you're using it as a short-term fill. Across the entire floor of your growing beds. White Dutch clover specifically fixes nitrogen at the soil surface, provides a physical barrier against weed germination, keeps soil temperature stable, draws in ground-foraging beneficial insects, and, critically, does not compete aggressively with your main crops if you keep it cut low. The reason it works so well inside a companion system is that it acts as a constant background layer of biological activity. Your soil is never exposed. Beneficial insect habitat is never interrupted. And because the clover is continuously building nitrogen in the surface layer, your heavy feeders, corn, tomatoes, squash, brassicas, have a slow, steady nutrient source right at root level without you applying anything. I've tracked my irrigation needs carefully over 3 seasons with and without living mulch, and the difference is somewhere between 30 and 40% less water on the living mulch beds. In a dry July, that's not nothing. Establish it early in the season when temperatures are still cool. Keep it mowed to about 3 inches so it doesn't shade out low-growing crops, and let it do its work underneath everything else you have going on. If you've been gardening seriously for more than a few years, you already know that the best gardens you've ever seen don't look like they're fighting anything. They look easy. Not because the gardener is lazy or lucky, but because at some point they stopped adding inputs to a broken system and started designing a system that generates its own inputs. That's what companion planting, done well, actually is. It's not a trick, it's not a shortcut. It's an acknowledgement that the intelligence that runs a healthy ecosystem has about a 4 billion year head start on any bag of fertilizer you're going to find at the garden center. Your job is to get out of the way of that intelligence enough to let it run. The garden I saw from the road that afternoon wasn't extraordinary because of what was in it. It was extraordinary because of how the things in it were arranged, and because someone a long time ago understood that arrangement well enough to pass it down through generations without needing to write a single word of it down. That's worth paying attention to. That's worth trying to learn.